The CEO was creating ghost employees to steal the payroll. When I reported it to the board, they blamed me for approving the hires. But they didn't know I saved every email where he pressured me to sign and had the digital fingerprints of who created each fake file. There are traps built with your own signature. Not because you put it there with bad intentions, but because someone calculated from the beginning that your signature would be useful when the moment came to need someone to blame. That is the coldest trap that exists, and it is exactly the one I almost fell into. I say almost because when the board of directors looked at me from across the table and told me the evidence suggested I had approved irregular hirings, I was able to open my laptop and show them something that completely changed the conversation. I had saved everything, not out of distrust, out of habit, and that habit was what saved me. My name is Gabriella. I am 42 years old. I am a human resources director specializing in talent management and labor regulatory compliance. I have spent 15 years in the discipline, the last 3 at a mid-sized technology company called NextGen Systems that developed management software for the financial sector. Human resources is a position that lives in a zone of simultaneous power and vulnerability in companies. You have access to sensitive information about the entire organization. You are the custodian of files, contracts, payrolls. You're also, when things go wrong, the first place the company looks for someone who has a signature on the wrong document. I learned that last part in the hardest possible way. And I also learned that a signature on the wrong document can be defended when you know exactly how your signature got there. The CEO's name was Ricardo Altamirano. He was 48 years old, had founded NextGen Systems 12 years earlier, and had the implicit authority that founders have in their own companies, an authority that does not need to justify itself because the company is, at some emotional and practical level, an extension of their person. That authority is also an institutional vulnerability zone. When the founder says something gets done, the people who depend on that company tend to do it without asking too many questions. I asked that question a little later than I should have asked it. The first signs came in my 5th month at the company. I received a hiring request for a senior systems architecture consultant position with a salary that for the level of the position was significantly above the range established in our compensation policy. The request came directly from the CEO with a note saying this candidate was a strategic hire requiring special conditions and that I could proceed directly. The candidate's name was Sebastian Altamirano, the same last name as the CEO. I asked the CEO if there was any family relationship. He told me it was a distant cousin, but that his credentials were solid and the hire was strategic for a specific project he was developing. I processed the hire with the discomfort of someone who knows something is not quite right, but who does not yet have concrete evidence of anything incorrect. In the following months, more similar requests arrived. In my first 18 months at NextGen Systems, I processed, under direct pressure from the CEO, 9 hirings that share characteristics I eventually learned to recognize as part of a pattern. All came with direct instruction from the CEO to proceed without the standard selection process. All had salaries at the top or above the established compensation range. Several had last names or reference connections that with basic searching linked to the CEO or his immediate circle. And when I tried to verify the actual activity of these people in their assigned projects, I found department heads who said they did not know them, emails that bounced, extension numbers nobody answered. What I did not find was real work. The moment I went from uncomfortable to actively concerned was when I tried to do a routine payroll verification and the system showed me that 3 of the employees hired under the CEO's scheme had systematically recorded overtime that raised their monthly compensation to figures that did not correspond with any active project in the company's project management system. I asked the systems department for an activity report of user activity on the company's internal platforms for the 3 employees in question. The report showed minimal or no activity in the weeks where the most hours were recorded. People collecting overtime for work that the systems did not record them as having done. That was not nepotism with inflated salaries. That was active payroll extraction. I started building the file with the methodology of someone who knows that what they are documenting may end up in a legal process where every element is going to be questioned. I reviewed the 9 irregular hiring cases. For each, I documented the CEO's original request, the email chain where he pressured me to proceed without following the standard process, the employee files with their contact data and supposed credentials, the activity reports in internal systems, and the payroll records with hours and compensation recorded compared with documented activity. And I found something else when I reviewed the metadata of the digital files in the human resources system. The files of the 9 employees had been created in the system with the CEO's user credentials, not mine. In the normal hiring process at NextGen Systems, the files were created by me as HR director. That was my function, and it was recorded in the system metadata as an action by my user. These 9 files have been created by the CEO directly from his system administrator access, which he had because he was the founder and had maintained that access since the company's early days. He then sent them to me for formal approval. My approval was real. The process that preceded it was not, and the metadata proved it. I went to the board of directors chairman on a Wednesday morning. NextGen Systems had a board with 5 external members, including a chairman, who in theory had the supervisory function that in well-governed companies acts as a counterweight to the CEO's power. In theory, I met with the board chairman, a 60-year-old man with a background in the financial industry who had been chosen precisely for his experience in corporate governance. I presented the case to him for 40 minutes. I showed him the 9 files, the emails from the CEO pressuring me to proceed, the metadata showing who had created each file, the activity reports and systems, the payroll records compared with actual activity, the basic searches linking 6 of the 9 employees to the CEO's family and social circle. He listened with attention. At the end, he told me that what I was describing was very serious and required an urgent meeting of the full board. He asked if I could be available the following day. I told him yes. The full board meeting was the most disorienting moment of the entire process. All 5 members were present. Ricardo Altamirano was also present, which I did not expect, and which in retrospect should have indicated to me how the meeting was going to unfold. The board chairman presented the matter, saying they had received information about possible irregularities in the company's hiring processes that needed to be clarified. Before I could say anything, Ricardo took the floor. What he said was constructed with the precision of someone who had had 24 hours to prepare it. He said he had independently brought to the board's attention the same matter because he had noticed irregularities in hiring processes that had gone through the Human Resources Department without following established procedures. That there were 9 hirings he had not authorized that had been processed directly by me. That he understood some of the hired employees might have connections to people in my personal circle. That the situation concerned him, and he hoped the board could investigate it. The board looked at me. I opened my laptop. I asked the board chairman for 2 minutes before responding. I share my screen with a room projector. I showed the first email. It was from the CEO. Date, time, recipient, my name. Text: I need you to process this hire today. It is urgent. It is not necessary to follow the standard process in this case. I take direct managerial responsibility. I showed the second. Same pattern. Different employee name. I showed all 9. Then I showed the file metadata. Creation date. User who created them. The CEO's username on each of the 9. Then I showed the system activity reports. Then the payroll records. Then the basic searches linking 6 of the 9 employees to the CEO's family and social circle. The room was silent for a time. I did not measure, but that felt long. Ricardo Altamirano said nothing. The board chairman said they needed a recess. The recess lasted 45 minutes. When they called me back into the room, Ricardo was not there. The board chairman told me the board had decided to initiate an independent forensic audit of the payroll and hiring processes of the previous 3 years. That during the audit process, Ricardo would be on administrative leave. That the board acknowledged my presentation had been solid, and that at no point during the audit process was my position at the company at risk. I thanked him. I told him I had copies of all the documentation presented in secure locations outside the company systems. He told me that was prudent. The forensic audit lasted 4 months. What the auditors found when they had complete access to all the financial and human resources systems was significantly broader than the 9 cases I had documented. The scheme had been operating before I joined the company. It had started more modestly 5 years earlier and had grown in scale and sophistication over time. The total number of ghost or semi-active employees with inflated compensation identified by the auditors was 27. The total amount extracted from the payroll over 5 years was a figure that when I saw it in the audit report required me to read it twice. And there was an additional element the audit found that I had not been able to see from my position. Several of the bank accounts to which the ghost employee payrolls were transferred converged in an account belonging to a holding company whose ownership, traced through corporate records, ended with Ricardo Altamirano. Not only the employees were receiving the money was coming back to him. Ricardo Altamirano was removed from the executive directorship by the board and was criminally charged for fraud and corporate fund diversion. The criminal process is ongoing. The people who had been hired as ghost or semi-active employees were notified that their contracts had been established irregularly. Some of them, those with family ties to Ricardo, were clearly conscious accomplices. Others, especially those connected through external references, appear to have been used without full awareness of the scheme. The company, under new temporary management designated by the board, is in a restructuring process with funds recovered through the parallel civil process. My emails. That was what changed everything in that room. Not my testimony, not my credibility, not my 15 years of impeccable career. My emails with their dates and their times and their metadata proving I had been pressured to sign and that the other person had created the files he later used to try to blame me. In human resources, as in any position that handles formal processes with a signature, there's a lesson this case taught me in a way I will not forget. When someone in a position of power pressures you to do something that does not follow the correct process, the first move you should make is to document that pressure. Not to accuse. Not because you expect something to go wrong, but because if something does go wrong, that documentation is the difference between being the victim and being the scapegoat. The difference between those two positions is a saved email. Save emails. Always save emails. If this story made you think, comment. Would you save every email where someone pressures you to skip a process? Like if you believe nobody should be able to use your signature to cover themselves. Subscribe for more real stories. Share with someone who works in a position where they sign documents and needs to know they can protect themselves. Practical tip. If you work in a position where you sign approvals or authorizations and someone in authority pressures you to skip the standard process, document that pressure in email before proceeding. Send yourself an email summarizing the conversation if it was verbal. That documentation can be the difference between being protected and being blamed if something goes wrong.